So I do various things in my lab, but I'd like to tell you today about our first baby steps towards reading minds and machines. So what do I mean by that? Well, can we read minds? Can we tell what a person saw by directly decoding his or her brain activity? And it turns out that the answer to this is yes. This is something multiple people are working on around the world. We too have a few papers in this area. And what you see at the top here are images that a person saw inside an fMRI machine. And at the bottom, you can see images we decoded directly from their fMRI brain activity. And on the way to doing this, we developed state-of-the-art encoders and decoders. Decoders from fMRI to images, and encoders from images to fMRI. Now I know this sounds scary, not to worry. Thoughts don't just float in the air, and we cannot do these kind of things without people's intended collaboration. And on the other hand, this may have lots of useful applications, including brain-machine interfaces, decoding dreams, communicating with locked-in patients, and exploring the brain. Some of these we already do, others are still in the future. What about machines? Can we read those? What do I mean by that? Well, we all train our networks on lots and lots of training data, and we tend to believe that this is safe. But can we decode the parameters of a trained classifier in order to reconstruct back the training data that it trained on? And it turns out that the answer to this is also yes, as we've shown in several recent NeurIPS papers of ours. What you see at the top here are images from the trained set of a CFAR10 classifier. And at the bottom, you can see images we decoded directly from the parameters of the trained classifiers. And as far as I know, we're the first ever to show that a fair portion of the training data is actually encoded in the parameters of the classifiers and can be decoded from the parameters of the trained classifier. Why is this interesting? Well, it of course has severe negative implications on data privacy, but it also allows us to explore to what extent deep networks really generalize versus only memorize their training data. And we show that they actually encode and memorize a fair portion of the training data, not all of it. We show that what they memorize is the training data that lies on the boundaries, or the decision boundaries of the classifier. But for those who come from the proper background, machine learning background, know that these are the most important training images. Those are the support vectors, if you'd like. So, what I'll do in this talk is first I'll give you a little bit of background in what we did in our initial work on reading minds and reading machines. But then I want to take you to something that I'm really excited about, how we can combine the power of brains and machines in order to go beyond what is possible to discover when you explore each of these domains independently. And I'll show you some of this is vision that I have that we haven't done yet, and some of this is already initial work, which I'll show you. All right, so let's start. Let's start with reading machines. So a little bit of background. So what do I mean by that? Well, by the way, this is joint work of multiple people, but the three main players behind this are Niv Chaim, Gal Vardi, and Gilad Yudei. So, you know, deep networks are amazing, right? We train networks to fit the training data. But somehow, surprisingly, despite the fact that networks are over-parameterized, there are more parameters than training examples. And even though in principle there are infinitely many solutions to the network that could fit the training data, somehow, surprisingly, networks do not tend to overfit the training data and they generalize well to new unseen test data, which is a mystery. A mystery that computer science, machine learning theoreticians explore, and they attribute it to what's called the implicit bias of the gradient descent. Now, I know that this is a very mixed audience here. Some of you are scientists, some of you are not. So the next minute will be devoted to the computer scientists in the audience, and those who are not computer science can put earplugs and take them out at the end of this slide, okay? So, for the computer scientists here, what does it mean, this implicit bias of the gradient descent? What it means is that if we train a deep network with gradient descent, then it must converge to what's known as a max margin classifier. In other words, its parameters must satisfy this set of equations. I don't expect anyone to understand this set of equations right now or follow it, but I do want you to notice an important thing. The first few sets of equations give us direct relations between the parameters of the network, theta j, and the training data, input xi, output yi. Now, what these theoreticians showed, and again, this is the only equation I'm ever going to show in any of this talk, so not to worry. As I said, I'll tell you when to take out your earplugs for those who are not computer scientists. But what these theoreticians showed is if you give training data, xi, yi, then this imposes constraints on the parameters of the network. It cannot be anything. It must be a solution of those equations. What we showed is, we asked, well, can we do the inverse? Given that we have the parameters of a training network, and we know that it must solve this set of equations, can we invert this set of equations in order to reconstruct the training data? And we showed that actually a fair portion of the training data, many of the examples, can be reconstructed from these parameters. Not all of them. The bottom equations here, which I'm not going to explain, show that we can only reconstruct the ones that reside on the decision boundary of each of the classes. But in any case, we can reconstruct those, and we've shown this for proof of concept networks. So those who are not computer scientists can now take out their earplugs. Let's look at examples. Okay. So we trained a classifier on a CFR10, a training set. We made sure that it doesn't just overfit the training data. And then we took the parameters of the training classifier, inverted those equations that I just now showed you, and reconstructed the training data from it. And here are the results that we got. Okay, here are some of the training images that we managed to reconstruct. You can ask, how good are they? Well, here are the corresponding real training images. And you can see that these are not accidental. We actually are able to reconstruct the training images. Not highest quality, they're noisy, there's place for improvement. But this really indicates that our data is not really secure, that it's somehow encoded in the parameters of the network. Again, not all of the data, as I said, these are only the examples that reside on the decision boundary, but if you think about it, these are the most difficult examples. By the way, I don't know what makes these difficult, okay? I looked at all the training data. These images are not more difficult than any other images. I cannot understand why they're difficult. And if we change the architecture of the network or initialize the parameters differently, the same images reside on the decision boundary, which is a mystery of its own. But, so we've had lots of extensions of this, but without much ado, I'd like to jump to the other side of this talk, mind reading. Again, there are several papers on this, but the three main players that what I'll show you now are my former students and current students, Roman Bailey, Guy Gaziv, and Encoding. And the idea is the following. A person lies inside an fMRI machine, watching images, and meanwhile, their brain activity is being recorded. And we look at the area, at the activation in the area of the visual cortex, and the question is, can we decode these activations to reconstruct back the images that the person saw? Now, this is not a new problem. Computational neuroscientists have been looking at this for more than a decade. And they said, let's take images and their corresponding fMRI brain activity and learn how to compute a mapping to decode fMRI into images. Initially, this was done using simple linear regression types of methods between handcrafted features. And in the last few years, of course, deep learning has come into play. But there's a serious problem here. There's not enough training data. You know, deep learning requires lots of training data. Now, by the way, I'm not a neuroscientist, nor do I acquire any fMRI data, but we download data sets of these pairs of images and corresponding fMRI. And when we started working on this, the largest data set you could have was with 1,200 pairs of images and fMRI. That's too little data. That's far from being able to span a huge space of natural images. Why is it so limited? Because there's a limit to how much time a person can spend inside an fMRI machine. And it's not like you can have this person watch those 1,000 images and this person watch those 1,000 images. That's not possible because our brains are different. If I and you watch the same image, our fMRI is going to be different, okay? And it's worse than this. The signal-to-noise ratio is horrible, okay? Each of those brain voxels, each of those pixels in the fMRI, is actually an average of 100,000 neurons, and it doesn't even measure their neuronal activity. It just measures how much oxygen flows, how much oxygenated blood flows to this brain region. So this forms a real glass ceiling to what you can do. So we said, let's overcome this by letting the networks self-supervise themselves. What do I mean by that? We trained two types of networks. One which we call a decoder, that learns to decode fMRI into images. This is what we will eventually use to decode our fMRIs. But if you train this only on those 1,200 pairs, it will just overfit the training data and not generalize well to new unseen data. So what we do is we train another network exactly in the opposite direction. We call it an encoder. It's a network that learns to encode images into fMRI. A slightly easier direction because it goes from high-resolution images to low-resolution fMRI. Still not trivial. But here's where the trick comes in. We add self-supervised training. The network teaches itself. How? Take any image without any fMRI. If you apply to it our encoder, it will generate some pseudo-fMRI, which if you apply the decoder to it, will generate some image, which initially will be a garbage because the decoder hasn't seen enough images. But we know that if those two networks, the encoder and decoder, are trained well, that this cycle from images to fMRI and from fMRI to images should result back in the same original image, okay? Which means that if we constrain this cycle between those two networks to give back the original image, we can use this to improve the network learning, especially those of the decoders. And note that this can be done on any image without any fMRI, which means we can train it on as many images as we want. And this allows us to adapt the decoder to the statistics of natural images, images that were never seen inside an fMRI machine. And for those of you who are computer vision scientists, we don't just match the pixels, we apply perceptual similarity, which allows us to reconstruct semantically meaningful images and adapt to never before seen categories inside the machine. But we can do more than that. We can switch the order of those two networks. Now, the input is an fMRI, and the output is an fMRI. And if trained well, those two should be equal, which means we can train our networks on fMRI without any images. And in particular, we can apply this cycle consistency to the test fMRI that we wish to decode. And this allows us to adapt our decoder to the statistics of the test data, which may very well be outside our training data. Now again, for the computer scientist, this is not an autoencoder. You have to make sure that the in between the encoder and decoder is real fMRI space, and between the decoder and encoder is real image space, and we take care of that. So let's look at results. Here is an image a person saw inside an fMRI machine, a fish. Here is what we decoded from their fMRI brain activity. So this is a fish, here is a whale, here is an airplane, a snowmobile, an outdoor scene, a llama, a beer mug, tambourines, and many other examples. Some are better, some are worse. Sometimes we capture the shape of the thing, like the circle over there, but not the correct color. And sometimes we get horrible results. Okay, these are the worst results from the test data. All of these, by the way, are tested fMRI, but were never seen during training. But as far as I know, we are state-of-the-art image reconstructions from at least at the time we published this. It was evaluated both by Amazon Mechanical Turk as well as by objective measures. So, as I showed you, we have initial capabilities of reading minds and reading machines. But what really excites me is the ability to combine the power of brains and machines to go beyond what is possible when you explore each one of those domains independently. What do I mean by that? Well, brains and machines are very different in nature. The weakness of one is the strength of the other. Machines can memorize data much better than humans. They can memorize millions of examples, something humans cannot. But humans can generalize much better than machines from very few examples. You show a toddler 3 images of a cow, it will recognize a cow when it sees one outdoor. It doesn't need to see thousands of cows in all various sizes and shapes from all orientation, which deep networks do. Okay? Now currently these two domains have typically been explored independently at different communities. There are computational neuroscientists that look at the connection between brain representations and deep network representations, but I want to go beyond this. I want to break the barrier between those two domains and develop direct encoding and decoding between brain activity and deep network activation. Why do I want to do this? Because I believe that this will allow us to discover things that are impossible to discover if you explore each domain independently. But it will, moreover, allow us to use each domain to train and improve the others. Brain to improve machines, and machines to improve brains. And this will hopefully allow us to start bridging the gap between minds and machines, between artificial and true intelligence. Now, why do I think that it's possible to develop such direct encoding and decoding between those two domains? Well, we saw that we can decode images from fMRI brain activity. Now imagine you were to take an external deep network that was trained on images, nothing to do with fMRI, and you were to plug it here. Then you can now trace back from the deep features back to the brain activity and find correspondences between deep network activations and brain activity. We can start finding correspondences between deep features and brain voxels. For example, we should be able, for each deep feature, to say which brain voxels reside in its receptive field, and for each brain voxel to say which deep features it affects, which parts of the brain are represented where in the deep network, and which parts of the brain are not represented in the network. The problem is that this requires a human in the loop, which means few data. But here's where our encoder comes in, okay? Our encoder allows us to encode images into fMRI and predict the fMRI activity on them, even if you were not in your fMRI machine. Which means we can now apply it to as many data as we want without a human in the loop, which means we can start comparing brain activity and deep network activation on infinitely many data. And this will allow us to start using one domain to train and improve the other. For example, we may want to use brain scanning in order to train deep networks to solve human-like perceptual tasks, or to train deep networks, external deep networks, to discover what is encoded where in the brain without a human in the loop. For example, imagine you want to know where certain categories are found in the brain. You can train a classifier to classify these categories, and now trace back to see which brain voxels gave rise to activation of these categories. Okay? So this will hopefully give a tool to brain scientists to explore the brain on infinitely many data without a human in the loop, and then verify it on few data inside an fMRI machine. Moreover, imagine, for example, you want to know where color is encoded in the brain, okay? You can take a color image, encode it using our image to fMRI encoding, and predict it to fMRI. Now you can strip off the color from this image, encode it, and predict the fMRI, and check which brain voxels have changed as a result of taking off the color. And since we can do it on infinitely many data, on any images that we want without any fMRI, we can start coming up with statistically significant hypotheses and then verify them on few data on a real human inside an fMRI machine. And we can do this to discover semantic categories or to discover where are memorable images encoded in the brain, and so on. Where is the bottleneck? The accuracy of this image to fMRI encoder. Now, the problem is we have only limited data per person, and these so far are human-specific, which means can we combine information from multiple brains in order to really train a powerful, single, universal brain encoder of all the brains in the world? Different subjects, different data sets, different machines. For example, you know, there are data sets. There's so many fMRI data sets accumulated all over the world on different machines. 7 Tesla, 4 Tesla, 3 Tesla, over decades. Each one of those groups just accumulates their own data, do their own tests on their own data. Can we somehow combine all this information from all the brains all over the globe in order to really train a very powerful universal brain encoder? This will give us orders of magnitude more training data and will allow us to really explore the brain. What's the problem? The problem is that our brains are different. They're not the same. If you and I watch the same image, and our fMRIs will be very different. And they'll be different it won't help if you anatomically align the two brains. They'll be different because, first of all, our brains are not rigidly the same, but also, if you see blue and I see blue, we functionally react differently to this. Which is why the few brain encoders that do exist out there are always subject-specific. They're trained per subject and are limited by the amount of training data a single human can see. But we said no, we want to overcome this barrier. We still want to take all these data sets without any shared data that people saw on so many different images in the machine and be able to train a single universal brain encoder. We call this, of course, this will give us, as I said, orders of magnitude more training data, and therefore a much better encoder. But more interestingly, and I'll show you this will allow us to discover shared functional regions across different brains and map information from one brain to another. And I'll show you this shortly. We call this the wisdom of a crowd of brains. Okay, this is a very new work which is currently under review, and the three main players are those students of mine, Roman Bailey, Nave Wasserman, and Amit Zilzer. And the idea is the following. We have all these different brains scanned on different machines at different locations in the world. Okay? They're all very different. Even if they were to see the same images, they would be different. Now, instead of trying to discover, to encode the entire in a brain, what we're going to do is we're going to work at the brain voxel level. What does that mean? We're going to map all these brain voxels from all these brains into a single shared voxel embedding space. I'll explain this shortly, on which we're going to train this universal brain encoder. Okay? Why do we do this? Well, as I said, fMRIs will be maybe different. A certain brain voxel in my brain and a different brain voxel in your brain may react the same way. I want to exploit this. I want to exploit similarity of individual brain voxels, both within my brain, maybe two different brain voxels in my brain react the same way, as well as across different brains and locations where I don't know where they are. And this zero presentation allows me to do this. And it gives me, instead of training on a few thousands of fMRIs, now I'm going to train on billions of brain voxels from all over the world. How are we going to do this? Well, for every brain voxel in every brain, we're going to learn what we call a voxel embedding. Okay, a voxel-specific embedding. It sounds like a very sophisticated word. It's nothing. It's just a code, a vector of 256. That's a code that learns to encode for this particular brain voxel what it cares about in images and visual information. How are we going to do this? Well, for each image that this particular brain saw, we're going to extract deep image features using a vision foundation model from low-level image features to high-level image features. And now, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that this brain voxel encodes what it cares about in those features. How? Well, we're going to train a network to compute cross-attention or cross-correlation, for those who don't know what cross-attention is, between this voxel embedding and those deep features, so that from this cross-attention, it learns to predict the fMRI activation of this particular brain voxel on this particular image. Now, this brain voxel is not image-specific. It's unique to this brain voxel. It must learn to predict the activation of this brain voxel on any image. It must learn to predict its fMRI activation. And therefore, this voxel embedding must learn to encode inside it what this voxel cares about inside images, whether it attends to low-level image features or high-level image features, whether it cares about the position of the feature inside the image or it doesn't care about the position. All this is optimized and encoded in this voxel embedding. That's the only thing that is unique to each and every brain voxel in each and every brain. All the other parts of the networks are shared by all brain voxels, which gives me billions of brain voxels to train on. This is so much more training data, which gives me a much better encoder. But what's more interesting and exciting, and this is what I'll show you next, it allows us to discover shared functional regions and what is encoded where in the brain across multiple people. So let's look at this. We said that all these brain voxels are mapped into a shared embedding space. Let's zoom into this shared embedding space. Of course, this embedding space is a 256-dimensional space, which I cannot show you, but here you can see a two-dimensional projection of it using T-scan projection, only of randomly sampled, and you can see that these are not uniformly distributed. They form clusters. Now, what does that mean? What is a cluster of brain voxels? It means that a lot lots of different brain voxels in different brains discovered the same encoding, discovered the same functionality they care about in images. This is cannot be accidental. It means that they've learned something meaningful. So we want to see what they learned. First of all, we know how to map each one of those brain voxels back to the brain, so we can find out where each one of those clusters locate inside each brain. And here you can see two different brains of two different people who have never seen any shared data, but they share these voxel embeddings. And we can find out where these shared regions are. Here I'm just showing you 4 clusters, but we have many more. Okay? But what's more interesting, we can find out what is that functionality that these brain regions learned. How? Well, we will check which images give maximal activation to the entire cluster of brain voxels. Okay? And when we do this, we find out the following: that the orange region is activated by food images. Okay? That's what these regions care about. Now, subject 1 and subject 2 never saw the same images, but they learned the same encoding of voxel embedding to food images. And the blue area is activated by sports images. And the purple area is activated by images that contain text. And the green area is activated by face images. Now, some of these are known to brain scientists, others are not. Moreover, we took a region that is known to brain scientists. Again, I'm not a brain scientist. It's called PPA. It's sensitive to places, that's what I'm told. And we checked whether we can find more fine-grained functionalities within this region. We took their brain voxels and clustered their voxel embedding. And we found 2 dominant regions in it. A place that is sensitive to indoor scenes and a place that is sensitive to outdoor scenes. These just surface out naturally from the data itself. We didn't have to explicitly ask about this. So let me summarize. My ultimate goal is to bridge the gap between minds and machines. In the long term, I'd like to develop direct encoding, decoding between brain activity and deep network activations, because I believe that this will allow us to discover new things and to use each domain to train and improve the other. But in the meanwhile, we are working on lots of exciting problems in each one of those domains, both mind reading and machine reading. In mind reading, so far we've been able to show that you can decode the training data from proof of concept networks. We're now trying to extend it to real world networks. But we're also trying to see how you can defend against our data privacy attacks. And I believe that these are directly related to adversarial attacks. Can we bridge the gap between memorization that deep networks are so good at and generalization that humans are good at? And can we train deep networks to solve human-like perceptual tasks? On the mind-reading part, can we explore the brain without a human in the loop? I showed you some initial results. So far, we've developed a universal brain encoder. We're now working on developing a universal brain decoder that will decode information from all brains. So far, we've been encoding and decoding visual data, but can we extend it to other data modalities? Speech, audio, text. There's such powerful foundation models today in text, large language models. Can we exploit these now in order to decode textual information? And what are adversarial attacks on the brain? We have an image to fMRI encoder. What are minimal changes to images that will make a significant change to the fMRI? And can we perform temporal super resolution in fMRI and discover new dynamic events that currently are beyond fMRI sampling rate, and therefore brain scientists cannot see them? So all these are problems we're working on, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michal, for this inspiring talk. To me, this hints that the boundary between artificial and human intelligence may disappear in the future, so we may need new terminology. Any questions from the audience? We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting study and research going on. My question is a little bit on the human side. Are you able to, of course you can infer from what a brain sees in images, but are you taking it further in terms of what you understand and how a person reacts to the understanding in terms of, let's say, I see an image, and if you ask me what did I see, I saw an airplane, but I said it's a motorcycle. So will you be able to distinguish in those aspects as well, brain activity, generalizing it? Thank you.
As I said, I'm not a brain scientist, but I do hope that the tools we provide will allow brain scientists to use this for doing much more interesting explorations that we currently are doing. Being able to distinguish between what a person thinks it is and what he sees is a separate question. Again, for brain scientists, but it's an interesting one. Yeah.
Thank you again for the great presentation. When you did the shared embedding of voxels for brains, when you reverse it, were some brains different when, or they had outliers for the same regions?
That's an excellent question, which we're checking right now. We're checking, can we find abnormalities in various brains? Okay, for example, we're now looking at people that have PSD, it's post-traumatic disorders, to see whether they react differently to images, whether things are encoded differently. And these are very interesting questions. Can you find abnormalities in various brains using these kind of things and using these mappings? This is all initial work. As I said, this is very new work, which is currently under review, but I believe it opens the door to many of these questions.
We look forward to that.
Chair, I have a question.
Yes.
So you started your talk by presenting the how to read machines and so this recreating the images which machines were learned from, right? And then you, in the brain, so you're showing the images you are recreating. I want to know. I want to see images I've been learned from when I was 5 years old.
I don't know how to do that.
Do you think that's possible in the future?
I don't know where that is encoded. I mean, currently we're using the brain activity at the moment to, but you know what? Maybe it is encoded somewhere. Actually, memories are probably encoded somewhere. Maybe we can find these kind of brain embeddings. Currently we're looking at the visual cortex, but you know, these could also, we want to extend it now to other brain regions, emotions and so on, the amygdala. I believe we will find interesting things there too.
That would be great.
We're not there yet.
Okay, the last question.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I have a question. You showed a good example of differentiating or separating different clusters for different domains like faces, cars and so on. Did you evaluate how styling these images or styling domains can change this separation in clusters? So for example, if we take images of faces, and if we take, for example, ugly or some cartoon-like faces, how they will be different in terms of one domain?
You're talking now about deep networks, not necessarily the brain, right?
How people interact or how they perceive this information, because people react differently on visualization of one domain.
Yeah. So it turns out that people react emotionally to images, and we are working now on detecting emotions from images. Currently we're doing this using deep networks, but we're now planning, as I said, to extend this also to the fMRI domain, and this will require going only to also to more to computing brain voxels of more brain regions that are more sensitive to emotions and so on. And I hope we'll have this in the near future.
Yes, thank you. I think I will be glad to discuss this afterwards in terms of interpretability of this task.
Glad.
Thank you.
Glad.
Right, so let's thank Michal again. And so let me welcome on stage our next speaker.